You can keep acrylics wet for days or even weeks if you use a wet palette. This is the handy palette from Masterson, but they also make the larger full-size palette. In this video, I'll set up the small palette so you can see how it works. So this is the Masterson Stay Wet Handy Palette. It's basically a plastic container. Pop the lid off. Inside you have the sponge, and here's the palette paper. The thing about this palette paper is that it's not actually like regular palette paper. It's designed to allow some of the moisture from the sponge to penetrate the paper and keep the paint wet. It comes with quite a bit of the palette paper, so you don't have to worry about using it up for quite a while. So let's set this up. I'm not sure what this is. Oh, this is a pack of wallet tissues. I probably should open it up better than this. There's 10 tissues in here, the 3-ply. I use it mostly indoors, but maybe I'll take these with me outside. The first step is to soak this paper in the hottest tap water you can get for 15 minutes. What that does is it opens up the pores of the paper so the water can seep through it better. Here's a container of hot water, and I'll just place that in there. I'll put a lid on it so that it doesn't steam up my camera lens. I'll let that soak for 15 minutes, and then I'll set it up with a sponge. A faster way to do this is to put it in a microwave-safe container and microwave it for 3 to 5 minutes until the water boils. Then you can use the paper. Another tip that I found in the instructions is that once you soak the paper like this, you could leave it in a container indefinitely so that the paper is always ready to go and you can paint whatever you want to. You can also reuse the paper so you don't have to use a fresh sheet every time. It will stain it, but it's still usable. I'll show you how to clean it later in the video. It's been well over 15 minutes. I went and ate lunch. Now I can set up the sponge with the palette paper. The sponge comes compressed like this. You have to soak it first. I figure I'll just use this bin of water. I can take the paper out and just give it a little rinse out. How much water you wring out of the sponge depends on what type of paint you're using. I'm using this kit of soft body acrylics, which has a thinner consistency than the thicker heavy body acrylics. So I want to wring out more water than what they recommend. They recommend wringing out about half the amount of water, but since these paints are more fluid, I'm going to wring out more. The next step is to place the sponge into the container. If you look at this, one side is coarser than the other. They recommend putting it with the smooth side facing up. When your sponge is dry, it might not fit in here perfectly, but once you wet it, it does seem to be cut right to the size of the container. I let the water drip off the paper and then place it down onto the sponge. You can see there's too much water on the surface, so all you do is take a rag or a paper towel and wipe off the excess. Once you're happy with it, you can squeeze out your paint and it should stay wet for as long as you're painting. To keep it wet with the paint in there, you put the lid on it and make sure it snaps shut. That will keep your paint wet for days and even weeks. These paints have been sitting in the palette overnight. Let's see if they're still wet. If you left this paint on a regular palette overnight, it would all be totally dry. You can see this is still wet, and even these thin sections are still wet. So you can see the benefit of having a palette like this where you can leave your colors sitting overnight. When you come back the next day, your mixtures are still there and you didn't waste any of that paint. It's really helpful because I have this painting mostly done, but I still need some of these colors for finishing up the details, and I want to fix a few things in here before I call it done. I have some final thoughts and tips about using a wet palette. The handy palette's good for smaller paintings. Mine was 12 by 12, and I think that's like the maximum size that I would use this for. After a while, you can start to feel a little bit cramped, especially when you're applying large areas of color. But overall, I think for 5 by 7s, 8 by 10s, it would work pretty well. If you want something larger, Masterson does offer a 12 by 16 Stay Wet palette. It comes with a sponge and paper, but I use mine with a glass palette. I have an entire video on how I set this palette up with a glass cutting board. There's a link to that video in the description below. I use it with my slow drying open acrylics, and they'll stay wet in there for weeks even without the sponge, which is really convenient. And when you close this, it's best to like pop the corners in place and then use the palm of your hand to press down rather than using your fingertips to try and squeeze it like this. That strains your hands. Mold is always a concern with a wet palette. If you have a sponge in here for like weeks, it's going to turn into a science experiment. One way I prevent mold is that I give it a cleaning like every 3 or 4 days. It's pretty simple. It doesn't take that long. What I do is I put down a sheet of cardboard, then I carefully lift out the palette paper with the paint on it and lay it down on the cardboard. You can see that the paint stained the sponge and it has no impact on the performance. When you rinse this out, it will fade a little bit, but you'll still have stains in here. Doesn't really matter though. What I do is I rinse this out under a sink and I scrub the bottom with hot soapy water. That way you get rid of any sort of mold that's developing in there Of course, your palette paper still stays the same, but I think flushing it out and putting fresh water in there seems to prevent mold. I've never had mold in any of these palettes. Just added some Dawn dish soap, and I'll use it to scrub down the inside. I would do this at a sink, but it's easier to set this up here at my desk. I would also wash off the lid too. Most importantly, you want to rinse off the sponge. I rinsed off the sponge in the container under a sink, and this is clean water. This is the same thing as setting it up. You soak the sponge and wring out about half the water or more if you're using thinner acrylics. Then you place the sponge smooth side facing up. Then all you have to do is replace your palette paper with the paint on it. You want to press it down. I usually use a palette knife to make sure it's in contact with the sponge, especially in the corners. Then you can continue to use this paint until you're done with your painting. Cleaning, it's the same thing. You would scrape off the paint, and you could probably save it if you want to. Then you can rinse off the palette paper or replace it if you don't like the stains that you see on it. Another way to prevent mold is to use distilled water because there's no microbes in it. But I think that if you flush this out every like 3 or 4 days, like I said, you'll never have an issue with it. If you find that your palette is drying out, like if you're working outside or you live in a very dry climate, you can add more water to the bottom of this. So what you would do is lift up a corner, pour a little water into it, place the sponge back down, and then just tilt this around to distribute the water throughout the palette. Another thing I do sometimes is I'll just lift up the paint palette carefully. You see there's less paint on here after I rinse it out, but you can also mist it with water if you only need a little bit of extra water. Then put your palette paper back down. I've also been testing out this rinse well from Masterson where there's a basin for washing out your brush, and then when it's too dirty, you can flush it and it refills up with clean water. So this is really useful for like watercolor, acrylics, and even gouache. It does hold quite a bit of water, and it is really convenient to be able to just have fresh water anytime you want to. It also has a few paintbrush holders where there's just a hole in there where you can place your paintbrush into it. Up next, you can watch my video about how I set up this larger palette, or you can watch a video about how I store leftover paints. Thanks for watching.